Hello, welcome to another meditation question and answer session. I'm joined here with Shraddha Barahi. My name is Yutta Dhamma. I am a Buddhist monk. And we're here to answer questions about meditation, and we're here to meditate. So study and learning in Buddhism is, or should be, very much intertwined or connected with practice. So it's not an exercise in gaining intellectual knowledge. It's an exercise in experiencing the knowledge and experiencing the cultivation of knowledge. So everything we say and talk about should be directed towards improving our practice and improving our connection with our experience. See, a big problem is that we're not very connected with our experiences. We're disconnected. We're in our heads too much, we would say in English, which means we're in the realm of concepts. We think in terms of people, places, things. And this isn't the truth about reality. Reality isn't made up of people, places, and things. So it disconnects us from what's really happening. Right? When you see a person, you're actually seeing first, and the person arises in your mind, the conception that that's a person. But before that, there had to be an experience of seeing. So the experience of seeing is more primary. It's more real in a sense. And so to get really in touch with reality, you have to stay in the realm of experience, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, feeling, thinking. You have to connect with that. Then you're able to see your reactions and your judgments and your partialities and your biases. You're able to see your good and bad habits and be able to differentiate. You're able to differentiate between them. If you live in the world of people, places, things, concepts, extrapolations, opinions, all of that is abstract. It's removed from reality. It's very difficult to see what's really going on and thus to make any real change. Any positive, any change based on actual understanding, based on clarity of mind. It's also much more peaceful to live in the now. It doesn't feel like that when you begin to practice, because we're wrestling with a mind that is so accustomed to following its opinions and judgments and reactions. So it's a bit of a struggle in the beginning, but once you get proficient with it, you can feel the release, the freedom from stress and from complication. It's very simple to just live with seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, feeling, thinking. So the way this works is we close our eyes, we take up the practice. If you've read our booklet on how to meditate, that's the basis of what we practice. And so you practice in that way. Start with the stomach, we'll say rising, falling, watching it rise and fall, noting all the other experiences that take your attention away. If you haven't read the booklet, well, that's the first thing you should do. You're welcome to stay here for the hour, but I recommended that before you get into asking questions, that you read the booklet and learn about the context in which a lot of the answers are coming. And if you have questions, then just post them in the chat. Open your eyes, post them in the chat, then close your eyes and go back to meditating. You don't have to sit there waiting for a reply. We'll reply when we get to it, if we get to it. Questions not about meditation, we may answer them. It's up to Shraddha whether she decides to ask them. And then it's up to me whether I decide to answer them. We'll try to be fair. All right. If there are questions, we can get ready to start asking and answering.
When I get frequently distracted by my own thoughts, I have sometimes tried to count the number of times my stomach rises and falls. Is this okay?
So it's a common practice in the beginning to try and find tricks, ways of controlling the mind, and that's not what we're about. So anything that tries to control the mind, and that's maybe not how you would phrase it, but that's really what you're trying to do generally, is trying to change things. Your mind is distracted by thoughts, and so your goal is to change that so that you're no longer distracted by thoughts. We're not about that. It may be surprising to learn, but we're about learning about the mind. So just seeing that your mind is frequently distracted by thoughts is an important first step. The way of combating it is learning to be objective and non-reactionary to your thoughts, because it's reaction that perpetuates it, that continues the mind to create new thoughts and get excited and interested in the thoughts and so on. So we would say to ourselves, distracted, and you really just need patience to allow that to happen until finally the mind gets it, that that's actually a stressful way of being. The goal is not because it's a stressful way of being, I should try and get rid of it, because that cultivates aversion. Right? So don't try and find ways to make it easier or to fix things. So no, I wouldn't recommend doing that. Try and be patient. If you get distracted, once you realize you're distracted, note it again. Distracted. Come back to the stomach, and again and again and again until the mind finally gets it. Oh yeah. Becomes more familiar with that process and realizes how much stress and unnecessary mental activity is involved.
Is it better to note everything that happens in the mind and body instead of just the breath?
So we don't normally note the breath, we note the stomach, and that's maybe what you're referring to. But maybe you haven't read the booklet, because the booklet describes using the stomach as a main object and then noting everything else when it arises. Once something else arises, note it, and then go back to the stomach. And repeat that whenever anything comes and distracts you.
Where should awareness rest when noting distracted?
Distracted is in the mind, and the mind doesn't take up space, which may surprise you. But that's what you're starting maybe to realize, is that where do I go? Because it's nowhere, right? The mind isn't anywhere. You don't have to go somewhere to note the mind. It's not about going somewhere. It's just about reminding yourself that was distraction.
When doing rising, falling, sitting, how long do I note the sitting, and what should I bring my mind to? While doing that, do I pause the rising and falling until I return to it?
You should note it just as long as it takes. Well, the noting only takes a moment. So you should only do it for as long as it takes to do it, which is just a moment. What should you bring your mind to? Well, it changes. Sometimes it's the legs, sometimes it's the back. Whatever it is that allows you to know that you're sitting, causes you to know that you're sitting. And no, you don't pause the rising and falling. It's a different object. So there would be no reason to pause anything. You're not even supposed to be interested in the rising and falling. Once you know the sitting, then go back and look at the stomach and wait for the next rising. This person's referring to a technique that we give to people during the course. It's something that is a part of later part of the course. So if you're wondering what this person's referring to, they're referring to something that we do in the course, the at-home course or the intensive course. If you're interested, you're welcome to take the at-home course by going to our website and learning about that. It's all free.
Bante, I'm a newly following your teachings and have a very sick friend. Is grief a good time to learn, or will the experience affect the way I learn?
No, grief is... See, what you're learning about is about grief. Things like grief. So don't be concerned that that's going to be a problem. That's actually an important part. The thing is, as an example, when you grieve, through the process of grieving, you're going to develop habits, reactions, patterns of behavior that are actually uncommon or new, right? And if you're not mindful, if you're not practicing, it will affect you in a bad way. And so the habits that you gain having come out of the process of grief may actually be problematic, may actually cause harm to you and others. If you're mindful during it, then the idea is if you're good at it, if you really do practice it during the time that you're grieving, you can come out of it with much better, more skillful habits and greater understanding. It's a very good time because there's many patterns of behavior that will come out during that time that you can learn about and refine and change for the better.
I'm trying to meditate with the neck sprain. Since pain is the clearest sensation, should I only note the pain for the whole duration of meditation session?
Note it for a while, but if after quite a while, like a long period of time, it doesn't go away, then just go back to the rising, falling. I wouldn't recommend noting it for the whole duration. It's not really wrong, but it can get obsessive. Recommend going to something more neutral, the stomach. And then if it distracts you again, the pain distracts you again, go to it again.
Bhante, there are some of the questions that are not exactly about meditation, so I'm going back to them. I've heard you talking against the use of sensory deprivation chambers for meditation. Isn't the use of things like that just an extension of closing your eyes?
Technically, there's nothing wrong with a sensory deprivation chamber. The question is why you're using it. So closing your eyes is, similar. Why would you close your eyes? It's a bit of a happy medium, I mean, closing your eyes is not an extreme form of sensory deprivation. It's meant to close off a main source of distraction. So preventing yourself from seeing is sensory deprivation, but it's useful in the sense that we get really distracted by seeing. Trying to cut off all your senses is a little bit self-defeating because you want to learn about your senses. The problem with keeping your eyes open is it's too much. It can be too much. And again, there's nothing wrong as well with practicing mindfulness with your eyes open. With your eyes closed, you are able to get more in touch with, say, the physical sensations, right, of pain and so on. We want to learn about these things. Being in a sensory deprivation chamber is, you've lost some prime fodder for practice of mindfulness. I mean, it's a good question. It's just the question a better question would be, why do we close our eyes? Why not just experience everything? Because the more senses you shut off, the less productive your practice becomes. It's in a sense more productive if you have your eyes open. The problem is it's just too much. So as a happy medium, we decide closing our eyes is probably in our benefit, because it's still lots when your eyes are closed. There's still physical sensations, and there's still sights, there's still sounds.
Bante, the next question is related. What is your opinion on doing samatha or vipassana with eyes open, focusing on a point? It seems that I got more distracted with them closed.
Yeah, I mean, that's really funny how this follows on that. That's the point of closing off the senses in the first place, is because it brings you closer to the mind. So again, with the happy medium, there's nothing wrong with being distracted. The distraction that comes from closing your eyes is, in a sense, welcome, because we want to learn about that. We want to understand how we get distracted. Again, it's not technically a bad thing to practice with your eyes open. It's not technically a bad thing to practice in a sensory deprivation chamber. It's just, I would say both of them are less optimal than sitting with your eyes closed. If you're very distracted, sometimes you can lie down. It helps to focus your attention, but you can also practice with your eyes open. We don't tend to encourage that. Again, if you're looking for a way, the thing about happy mediums is they try to create a sort of a default state. If you're looking for a way to improve your practice, you probably got that's a problem, trying to improve your practice. The happy medium, the default, finding a sort of a middle ground, is a good way to avoid falling into any extreme or any partiality, any trying to make your practice easier. That's why sitting, I think, is another reason why sitting is such a good posture, because it's halfway. It's a default sort of. It's not as stressful as walking or standing, but it's not as relaxing as lying down. So it's somewhere in the default middle. And none of the postures are wrong. It's just practically sitting with your eyes closed is a good happy medium. Doesn't mean it's easy. It actually makes it quite challenging, but it also makes it more productive for not falling into extremes or becoming biased or favoring one state over another.
Is it helpful to note while meditating that every arising of a will to control the meditation is itself a mere result of impersonal causes and conditions?
So it's helpful to note thinking, if you start to think that sort of thing. You're using a different form of the word note. It's not helpful to note in the way that you're thinking. It's helpful to note in the sense of reminding yourself. That's why I don't use the word noting very much. I ask people to say to themselves, just to make it clear that I actually want you to use the mantra. And I use the word remind, because that's what the word sati means. So it's helpful to remind yourself that you're thinking when you're thinking. If you start to have these conceptions that every arising of a will to control is itself, etc., you have to say to yourself, thinking. That's what you have to note. You have to remind yourself, hey, this is thinking. So because you've forgotten that, you've gotten into discursive thought. You've lost the actual experience.
Curious why you stress stopping during walking meditation to note thinking rather than note thinking or seeing while stepping and going back to the foot like we do with the breath while sitting.
Because there's mental activity involved in walking, in moving the foot. So if you continue walking, it's not productive in the long run. Now, to note thinking, we generally don't stress stopping. If it's just a stray thought, you can just ignore it. But if you really get distracted, If you're thinking a lot, you should stop and say distracted, distracted. It's fine to stop and say thinking. That's not wrong. It's just probably better practice in general to not try and note every stray thought, if it's just a stray thought. In the beginning, you're just going to be very distracted, and that's different. You should stop and say, just stop walking and say distracted, distracted. It's too distracting to try and walk and note something. You're kind of defeating the purpose. I mean, I think ultimately I'd have to say, is it wrong? No, it's not wrong, because you can be that quick. It's just it's too distracting. Too many things at once. So best practices. People often try and ask, is this the right way or is that the right way? And it's not so much like that as it is best practices. The best practice is generally the way it's instructed, as we've done this a lot. It's been passed on and passed on and passed on. Often the best answer is just, well, that's the way my teacher tells me to do it, so I'll do it that way.
I would like to have a stable practice every day. I tried to meditate for 1 hour a day. I did not succeed. Now I meditate every day for at least a minute. Do you recommend this approach to meditation?
Well, a minute's better than nothing, but I mean, I recommend doing more than that, of course. I recommend trying to be mindful during your daily life, include that, and try and find a way to complement, to have your formal practice complement your daily your ordinary practice in your non-formal life. Like when you're walking around, try and say to yourself, walking, walking. When you're standing, say standing. When you're sitting, say sitting, sitting. Another thing I recommend is find a teacher and try and do a course, because when you're with a teacher, it's much easier to keep a schedule, generally. The other thing I suppose I'd recommend is start succeeding, which seems like a terrible thing to say, but sometimes you just have to, do it, Sometimes you just have to make the change in your life. Like there's no secret, there's no trick to it. You just have to make the decision and say, just do it. Because it's easy to get lazy and start to think, well, I'll just wait until it comes to me to do it. Well, sometimes you have to say, all right, I'm going to do it.
After seeing the repetitiveness in the experiences, I have stopped meditating to not be overwhelmed by those experiences. Is it okay to take a break from meditation when overwhelming experiences?
It's okay, but it would be much better if you could come to terms with that. And the feeling of being overwhelmed, what is that? And meditate on that. Say to yourself, overwhelmed. Look at the liking or disliking, worry, fear, boredom, stress, whatever. Taking a break is kind of aversionary. No, it cultivates aversion.
When noting rising, falling, sitting, touching, how long should I wait for the sensation at the left, right, back to appear? Or should I note the touching without feeling the area?
The touching is the mind touching that spot. So when the mind is in that spot, you can just say touching. You don't have to wait for some feeling. Sometimes you'll feel something, sometimes you won't.
Is it necessary to be able to accurately label or note? For example, does it matter if I inaccurately noted anxiety, but in reality it is heartburn or something else?
Yeah, it does matter, because it means you didn't really get what you were experiencing. It actually matters quite a bit, because if you get into just noting something, then it becomes meaningless and conceptual, and can be actually dangerous if you get caught up in that sort of using the mantra for the mantra's sake. It should only be when you feel something. Realizing that you're actually just feeling heartburn or something physical is a very important part of it, being able to accurately and clearly see what you're experiencing. That's an important part of the progress. But it's not so much that it's necessary as it is a skill that you're trying to gain. So over time, you'll be better able to accurately note what's going on, and you should be clear about that goal, in the sense that don't be complacent and don't be content with just noting anything, because that could lead to problematic consequences.
I try to meditate, but after some time I fall asleep. Please tell cause of this and the solution also.
Well, try and get enough sleep. Try not to meditate when you're too tired. If you're, but in the beginning, this is quite common, because quite often people have very strong concentration and not very strong effort or energy. So you have to balance that. Do walking meditation. If you're drowsy when you sit, try and stand up and do walking meditation. If you're not doing walking, that's a really good support in the beginning to adjust this. It's a really good way to adjust the imbalance between effort and concentration. It's the kind of thing that works itself out if you do walking and sitting together regularly.
I'm trying hard to practice while conversing, but it is very difficult for me without losing empathy and attention towards the interlocutor. Do you have any advice?
Ultimately, it's going to push you away from social situations, right? There is a conflict there. If you're always caught up in people and their issues, then you're gonna have a hard time being mindful. And if you start trying to be mindful, it's very hard to have any interest in people's problems and issues and the world. That's really not a bad thing. It's ultimately not productive for us to get caught up in people's issues and lives, but it does make social situations difficult when there are expectations that are often unreasonable. People expect you to be engaged and involved and interested in things that are ultimately not particularly worth being interested in. Like if someone has a problem, for example, them telling you the details of their problem is not really the most useful thing for either of you. What's most useful is for them to learn how to be with their emotions, to be mindful, to be with what you're trying to be as you observe and interact with them mindfully. We don't realize that you really don't have to talk about your problems. And there's so much unnecessary talk. What we have to talk about is our experiences.
How do I practice in a way that I don't get too obsessed or zoned out on rising, falling of stomach?
Well, try and note everything else as well. Try and do walking meditation. Consider taking a meditation course, because the rising, falling isn't the only object, and we explain further practices throughout the course. If you're interested in taking a course, you can go to our website and learn about that. I know it sounds like I'm like promoting something as though I get something out of it, or it's like what we're here for, but it really is a constant answer that we have to fall back on. I mean, the only answer is not to listen. The real answer is not to listen to what I'm saying. You know, my answers are not going to fix your problems. Ultimately, practice is, and practice is best conducted with a teacher. So it's just an inevitable part of this program that I constantly come back to. Read the booklet, do a meditation course, because Buddhism isn't just about gaining intellectual. It should never be about gaining intellectual knowledge. You're not here to learn something intellectually. You're here to help yourself become free from suffering. And that's a practical, it's a hands-on sort of activity. It's not something you can sit there and gain from me by my talking. So, recommend getting interested in actually taking up the practice of meditation. Anyway, I'm not accusing the person who asked this question of that, but yeah, definitely recommend reading you've probably read the booklet. Recommend doing a meditation course. We have an at-home course now that's meant to help people who can't take an intensive course.
I'm feeling frustrated a lot. I feel edgy. I struggle with seeing where progress is headed and how the technique is working. How should I proceed?
Well, you should proceed by noting your frustration, your feelings of edginess, or whatever that would be. Edgy, like, would be restless or anxious. Struggle with seeing where progress is headed. You should note that you're obsessed over some sort of theoretical progress, and some way of knowing whether it's somehow working in some way. All of that you should just let go of, because all of that is causing you stress and suffering, frustration, right? So you're actually gaining something from the practice. You're learning how your approach to things is stressful, and that's going to change the way you approach things. You'll be less goal-oriented. You'll be less focused on progress or goal, results, and so on. You'll be much more content, as a result, because you'll see that being discontent is stressful. So it's working. Proceed by continuing. You'll learn. You'll get it eventually. The mind will let go, and there will be more peace. Try and note all of that you're experiencing.
After learning that experience is truly uncontrollable and seeing the mind conceives of the self, I've become less inclined to meditate. I'm afraid of losing myself. Any advice?
Note the fear. Say afraid, afraid. There's nothing special about that. It just happens from meditation. It happens from intellectualizing it and getting caught up in ideas that somehow you're going to lose something valuable or so on. Note aversion to meditation, that sort of thing. Because meditation isn't real, right? It's just a concept in your mind. You become averse to it. There's nothing different about sitting still or cross-legged or walking back and forth. There's nothing different about that from ordinary experience. Why can't you do that?
I focus more on the instructions than the meditation, in that I focus solely on the breath. Then I don't notice the unbinding of stress when I note. How can I focus more on the ending of stress?
I'm not sure that that's what we're interested in doing. I would focus on whatever's there. I'm not quite clear where the issue is, or it sounds like it's not quite how I would try to understand the practice. You know, if you're focusing solely on the breath, well, first of all, we try to focus on the stomach, which is kind of the breath, kind of not, but the stomach rising and falling, and then when other things arise, note them as well. But this noticing the unbinding of stress may be an experience. If you feel, release of some sort, you can just note feeling. I don't know about focusing on the ending of stress, sounds sort of maybe misguided. If you haven't read the booklet, recommend taking that up. If you have, maybe try doing a course.
Trying to be mindful all day, I've come to wonder, is it possible to be in a hurry and continue to be mindful?
It depends what you mean by being in a hurry. If you're, anxious, then you're not mindful. So there's often anxiety associated with hurrying. But if you're just physically rushing, like running or walking quickly, it's doing something quickly, that's not necessarily cause for unmindfulness. But when you're mentally in a hurry, like stressed about how slow things are going and worried and afraid that you might miss something, that's going to stop you from being mindful for sure. But all this wondering, you have to note wondering. If that's all it is, stop getting caught up. Don't get caught up in the wondering. Say wondering.
I find it easier to note sensations such as rising, falling, pain, pressure, numbness, etc., but struggle with noting states of mind. Am I doing it right?
I don't know. There's nothing about struggling that tells me whether you're doing it right or wrong, because we all struggle with different things. Struggling with noting the state of mind is, I guess, pretty common. Depends on the individual. But you don't have to try to note anything. You just note what's there, what you experience. You don't have to go out of your way to find something to note. If you're noting all of those things you say you're noting, that's a great start. When just as long as you're not excluding certain experiences, like when you think something, don't exclude that. You should say thinking. When you have emotions, you shouldn't exclude that. If you notice that you're angry, you should say angry. If you notice that you like something or want something, you should note that as well. But if you don't notice it, then I wouldn't concern yourself with it. You can sometimes check whether you're ignoring something, like, oh yeah, there's like read over the four satipatthana and look and say to yourself, oh yeah, that one I've noticed that, but I forgot to know. I didn't think to note that. I didn't like that a lot, but I didn't ever say disliking. Yeah, you ignored it, basically. That's the problem.
I'm struggling with the amount of attention I need to the noting and the breath. Sometimes I feel I focus too much on the noting. Any advice?
There's so many common problems like that in the beginning. I wouldn't stress yourself out about it. Try and note that. So rather than trying to do things differently, note how you're doing them. Note the result of how you're doing them. Because part of what we're trying to see is how we engage in the process of seeing, right? How we practice. Part of the practice is learning about how we approach anything. So even just, let's say, watching the stomach, we're trying to learn about how we approach that task, right? Even that task is going to be so caught up in our biases, in our predilections, in our bad habits, good and bad habits. But some of them are pretty bad, like trying to control and so on. So when, for example, you try to control the breath, you don't have to stop yourself from controlling it. You just have to keep doing it until you see that, oh yeah, this isn't the right way to do things. And eventually your mind will let go by itself. So when you feel whatever it is that makes you feel, you're not actually feeling that you focus too much on the noting. You're feeling something. And then your reaction to that is to say, this is too much, or this is me focusing too much. But no, there's something more primary there. It's a feeling. What is the feeling that leads you to think to yourself, I focus too much on the noting? You don't feel that. You feel something. Note that feeling. When you think you're focusing too much on the noting, note thinking or even judging. If you're frustrated, note that as well. You don't have to adjust the amount of attention. You just have to do it and learn. Learn how wrong you're doing it, and keep learning. And it's all the learning about how wrong you're doing it that's going to make you eventually do it right.
Would mindfully relaxing a tense feeling after noting it be counterproductive in the long term?
So I have to tease you a little bit, because it's these questions where you add the word mindfully, and it's well intentioned, and there's nothing wrong with this question. It's just a little bit funny, because it's like if you put the word mindfully, then it's all right? So I'm sorry. I don't mean to single you out or anything, but it's important to note, because we use the word mindful in so many different ways. We use it as a buzzword now. People say, "Oh, I'm mindful all the time anyway. I'm just naturally mindful." I don't practice meditation, but I'm very mindful when I make art, or when I play the piano, or when I rock climb, or so on. Right? So if you're relaxing a tense feeling, there's a reason why you're relaxing it. There's nothing wrong with any activity per se, but why are you relaxing it? And the reasons why you're relaxing it have nothing to do generally with mindfulness. They have to do with partiality, judgment, attachment, even identification. I am tense, that sort of thing. Tense is bad, is a judgment. Wanting to feel pleasure, it's craving. All of that is unmindful. So it really most likely is you're not doing anything mindful. There may be moments of mindfulness in there, but it's not a very mindful activity generally. So no. The only reason is if someone had an injury, or let's say you got a cramp, one of those cramps where you sit wrong and it just pulls something, and it's really, I don't know, it feels like it could be dangerous. Well, then you might want to, massage it out. Like some people I know, there was an old man who had pulled something in his shoulder, right? Like he had this nerve. It's like a nerve, and so he had me push down on his shoulder, and he said, "Push there very hard." I don't know I don't know if that's actually dangerous, but it could. I guess it could be. And then you might want to say, okay. So that's an example. If there's cases like that, if someone has injuries or that sort of thing, it's not to say that any kind of massage or relaxation is wrong, but most of it is. Most massage, relaxation, that sort of thing is wrong from a perspective of mindfulness, because it's not mindfulness. The word mindfulness is just, first of all, it's the wrong word. Second of all, if you take it to be the right word, it has a very specific meaning. So most things that we call mindful are not technically mindful. It's not a proper use of the word. Or we could just abandon the word entirely and use more accurate terms like reminding yourself, and there's no good word in English, and I guess mindful is the best one. But it literally means, do you remember the experience as it is? And so yes, as you're doing the relaxing, you can be mindful, but your reasons for doing it and your inclination while you're doing it is not to observe, it's to change, it's to fix.
What is your internal dialogue, if you have any, when unwanted thoughts appear during meditation? And they're probably asking for what they should do.
Well, you would say to yourself, thinking. If it's unwanted, that's a state of mind, and you would say disliking. It's basically disliking.
Bante, I was asking just the practice-related questions, but there are a lot of other questions, so maybe I could start with some of them.
Sure.
This one, maybe a longer talk, but I read this word equanimity reading about meditation. Can you expound on this?
Yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about the word. As a theory, there's use in understanding the idea of being equanimous. So I think the problem with it is that if you focus on equanimity, then it becomes an activity of trying to be equanimous, which you shouldn't do. You should try to see clearly, try to observe, and the equanimity comes from it. It's kind of like, you know it's working when you're more equanimous, rather than I should try and be more equanimous. You shouldn't try to be more equanimous. You should try to see clearly. The equanimity comes really along with that, with the objectivity. But there are many ways that equanimity works in Buddhism, many ways of talking about it. There's good equanimity, there's bad equanimity, there's lesser and greater, there's like 8 different types of equanimity or something.
Do all attachments lead to suffering?
Yes.
Morality universal or relative? What is the foundation for morality?
Well, these really are off track, aren't they? Sorry, I don't mean bad questions. They're not really meditative questions. I'm not sure if I like where this is going. So is morality universal? Morality is universal. What is the foundation for morality? Right. Okay, now this is a good question. The foundation for morality is whether it leads to stress or suffering. Meaning, if something does lead to stress or suffering, it's immoral. That's actually it. That's actually morality. But it's not quite that, because it's not like you look to the results. It's it being bad, and that's why it leads to stress and suffering, because you don't want to be too focused on results and outcomes. It's almost that it is that it's inherently wrong, inherently inconsistent or misguided. So it's like you do something for some purpose, and it doesn't bring about that purpose, or it's counterproductive. It doesn't have, it's misguided. It's a product of a misunderstanding. Because when you steal, for example, you do it because you want to be happy, ultimately, and that's not a good way to be happy. It's not right. It's crooked. It's perverse, I guess. There is actually a sort of intrinsic perversion to certain things. Ultimately, physical and verbal acts aren't immoral, can't be immoral, but when a mental quality, a perverse mental state, leads to certain states, we call the states immoral as well, the actions and the speech. Ultimately, it's the mind state, and the intention to do those things, the inclination to do them, that's immoral. Because, for example, the classic example is if you step on an ant and you didn't know it was there, from a Buddhist perspective, that's not immoral. It's not intrinsically immoral to kill someone or something. But the intention to kill, well, that's pretty darn immoral. And if it leads you to actually kill someone, it's going to have lasting consequences on your psyche and on your future.
When contemplating impermanence after seeing rising and falling, what is the nature of the experience? Is the contemplation reflective, discursive thoughts, or just an awareness of something else?
I'm not sure. Like, I think I could figure out this question. I'm just not inclined to. Sorry, I don't mean to be judgmental, but I don't think this is that useful. I don't think this is that beneficial to think about these sorts of things. So let's pick it apart here to show you what I mean, how I'm perceiving this. When contemplating impermanence, that's not something you should do. Impermanence is a realization that comes to you through mindfulness. You shouldn't contemplate it. Seeing the rising and falling, well, that's good, yes. You're doing something right there. But after seeing the rising and falling, you should see the rising again. That's what you should do. What is the nature of the experience? Besides what you experience, besides what you see by watching the rising and falling and everything else, nothing. Is the contemplation reflective, discursive thoughts, or just an awareness of something else? It is what it is. The contemplation is contemplation. So it's thinking, you should not thinking, or even contemplating. So I guess I did sort of answer it, but it does seem that this question is coming from thinking too much, perhaps. Try to just not thinking.
Is there a recommended universal approach to introducing children to meditation and the Buddha's teaching?
Learn yourself first. It's very important that you learn about meditation as a parent or as a guardian of children, even if you're not a parent. Because once you learn, you're in a pretty good place to teach others. You're in a pretty good place to explain and describe the practice to others. There's nothing really special about teaching children. This technique is totally applicable and practicable for children. I did some videos on the topic. I'm not saying they're the best. I'm not even sure they're the best, but maybe they're useful. The thing about the videos is I tried to give a general understanding of the idea of using a mantra. So it's not entirely about mindfulness. It's not entirely about reality. I have them note cat, like visualize a cat or a color in their mind. Colors are a very common Buddhist object of meditation. I had them focus on mother and father and that sort of thing and just say mother, mother, father, father. But ultimately got into the idea of watching the stomach rising and the four satipatthana. So you might check those out. Maybe they help. I know I had one student who used them with their children and said they worked. I think other people have told me as well that they were maybe helpful. But it might give you some ideas, at least, to do it your own way.
Is celibacy, attraction to opposite sex, an impediment to progressing one's meditation practice? It is non-celibacy.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, you can't pair those two things together. Oh, wait, celibacy and, because they can be together, you can be celibate and still attracted to the opposite sex. So maybe that's what they're referring to. But maybe they're talking about incelibacy. Let's talk about it all, I guess. So being incelibate, yes, is an impediment. And attraction to the opposite sex, yes, is an impediment. Though the latter, attraction to the opposite sex, is something you can take as a meditation object. Being incelibate is really counterproductive because it's the encouragement and the cultivation of attraction, right? The more incelibate you are, the more attraction you're going to cultivate. But simple attraction is just an experience, and it's something you can be mindful of, wanting or liking. So it's less of it is an impediment, but it's also an object of practice. So it actually, practically speaking, is a good thing to have come up, because it helps you learn about it. It helps you learn about attraction. When it comes up, you can note it. But actively cultivating it, well, that's the problem. That's cultivating bad habits. Because you can't be objective when you're liking something. You're not able to see it clearly. It's a product of delusion, the feeling that that thing is going to be stable, satisfying, or controllable, when in fact it's unpredictable, unsatisfying, and uncontrollable.
When noticing tension, should I release it or maintain the effort to remain tense? This is a follow-up question to the question earlier.
You shouldn't maintain the effort. Why would you maintain the effort to remain tense? Maintain, like actually try to stay tense? You shouldn't do either. When you note the tension, you should just note it. So it kind of, I guess, it sounds like there's this idea that somehow you're creating that, like it's you. There's a self that is creating the tension, and that's not the case. It is you in the sense that it's not anybody else, but the you is much more complicated than that. It's not something you can just turn off or release it or maintain it. It doesn't work like that. Just notice it, and you'll see it should release by itself when it's good and ready.
When meditating somewhere noisy during sitting, with many noises arising, must I go back to the rising and falling? If so, when?
So yeah, you should note sound. You would say hearing. And if it goes away, it goes away, and then go back to the rising and falling. If it doesn't go away after a while, you can just ignore it and go back to the rising and falling anyway. You should go back to the rising and falling.
Is it advisable to switch posture multiple times in a 1-hour meditation session?
So it's advisable to do half walking and half sitting. So if you're doing 1 hour total, you do half an hour walking, half an hour sitting. If you have to switch postures, like move your position a little bit, that's fine. But try and be mindful. I guess try not to. If you can. If you're in pain, say pain. But when you have to change, just say wanting to move or something. Moving, and so on.
Bante, in vipassana meditation, we are taught to pay attention only with bare attention to what is happening to nama and rupa. And how do we get the wisdom, understanding, if we don't analyze it?
So, yeah, there's a real sort of disconnect between the Buddhist idea of wisdom and a modern sort of, I want to say Western, but it's not unique to the West. It's just an ordinary understanding of wisdom. Our ordinary understanding of wisdom is that it's conceptual, analytical, right? Wisdom is something you get from analyzing things. It's not true at all. Intelligence, perhaps, and that's might be what we would call intelligence. There's a lot of knowledge you can get from analyzing. You can't get wisdom that way. Although you might call it analysis. It's just a different kind of analysis that goes on automatically as you observe. So it's precisely because you're not analyzing, that you're not discursively thinking about the thing, that you come to gain wisdom. You come to gain because what we mean is a clear understanding of the nature of reality, clear awareness of the way things are, understanding of the way things are. What is this like? What is that like? You'll only get that if you're attentive, if you're paying attention and bear attention. If you're analyzing and extrapolating upon, you're never going to get that clear awareness. Usually people miss wisdom. They're gaining so much wisdom and then they don't realize it, and so they start to doubt, start to feel like the practice is not giving them the benefit it should, even though it actually is. Because the wisdom is understanding how you're doing everything wrong, understanding how you're trying to control things, understanding how you try to analyze everything. All right, that's an hour. We're trying arbitrarily to limit this to 60 minutes. And we've done so. So are there any good questions? Not that there are bad questions, but any questions that you think, boy, this person really needs an answer, it'll help them a lot in their practice. Are there any of those left?
There are a few questions. Some of these questions you've answered in other videos, so maybe we could just point to other videos. Like, for instance, this one, it's about the precepts.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's not really about meditation, but yeah. I did a video on it, I guess.
Yeah, I think there's a video. You've also answered it in some of the videos.
Yeah, there's also a meditation frequently asked questions on our website. We could add to that. There's some people who are actually transcribing some of the answers, I think. So maybe it'll get bigger. So maybe that's it. Are we done?
There's a question about when doing 2 hours, is it better to do walking, sitting for half-hour intervals or 1 hour intervals?
It really depends on, you'd have to have a bigger picture of your practice. I mean, 2 hours at a time, if that's the only meditation you do during the day, I think for a lot of people, half hour might be easier. But generally, yeah, it would be 1 hour walking, 1 hour sitting. It's just that if that's all you do during the day, that can be quite stressful because you're not that mindful if that's all you're doing for the 24 hours. It would be better, I would think, generally to do an hour in the morning and then like 8 hours later, another hour, that sort of thing. If you space it out, then it's more a part of your life. So I'd have to know more about your daily routine to really answer that well.
There's also this question about some experience they were having in meditation. Maybe they could sign up for your at-home course. They are not already doing it.
Well, that sounds like actually what we call PT. If that happens, you should tell it to stop. Say stop. Just actually say stop. Why does it happen? It happens mainly, if I'm reading it right, it happens from it's what we call piti or rapture, and it happens from concentration, from repetition, and the mind's sort of complacency. So when you tell it to stop, the mind sort of ends that sort of the mind's subtle encouragement of it. Just tell it to stop, it usually stops.
Someone had some questions about speed in which you walk. I think, I don't see the question, but you talked about that a lot there were a bunch of questions about speed of walking in
Yeah, I don't know.
from
Hopefully
last time.
that might be in the frequently asked questions. Hopefully it is, because that's a common one. Shouldn't be fast, shouldn't be slow. That's the general answer. All right, I'm calling it. That's enough for today. I'll be here again. There'll always be more questions, it seems. There'll always be new people. If you've heard all the answers already, then what the heck are you doing here? Go practice. No, it's fine. I'm happy to have you, but this is this is an ongoing thing. I'll keep answering questions. Happy to do it. Thank you all for your interest and for your good questions. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your question or if the answer wasn't what you'd hoped for. I'll try my best. Try better next time. Have a good day, everyone. Wish you all peace, happiness, and freedom from suffering. Sadhu. Don't we have a sadhu page? Sadhu. There we go. Thank you, and thank you, Shraddha. Thank you.